Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Femi Osofisan's play Tegonni, an African Antigone. Now, as the subtitle suggests, this is an adaptation of the Sophocles play Antigone, but Osofisan makes a number of significant changes. So one of the most obvious and basic changes that he makes is that he transitions the action from mythical Thebes to late 19th century British colonial Yorubaland, which is now part of Nigeria. But for me, there's a lot more interesting changes that go on here. There are thematic changes, there are political changes that go on that make this a much more interesting adaptation than just changing the setting. So, Osofisan's play, like several of his other adaptations, including things like Wisu, Hamlet, really blends genres, blends styles, in particular combining African mythology, African folk songs, African folk stories, African theater and performance styles with the ancient Greek source material. So we get this in a number of different ways. Some of the most overt of which are that this play actually begins with Yemoja, who's a river goddess, a Yoruba river deity. We're introduced to the play via sort of celebrations going on her boat. So that opens the play. And interestingly enough, it also closes the play. But I'll talk about the ending of the play in a little bit. So one of the things that Yemoja does is she sort of introduces Antigone. Now, this is a sort of postmodern element because we have Tegonni, who is a sort of African avatar of Antigone. She is playing out the basic plotline of Sophocles' play, but then we also have Antigone from Greek mythology, and she arrives on Yemoja's boat basically as a sort of guide and moral conscience for Tegonni. So we have these two characters, both of whom are avatars of Antigone, and they're interacting with one another. And so we have that really interesting dynamic, even to the point where Tegonni's retinue, her sort of bridesmaids and things like this, challenge Antigone and her followers, asking them if they're the characters from the Greek mythology, and saying, you can't be the characters from the Greek mythology, you're not white. And Antigone, so I don't have the direct line in front of me because I had a digital copy of this that I photocopied my own digital copy out of the one version of this play that the university where I did my PhD was able to get through interlibrary loan. But I think it's sort of collectively called Antigone's Crew, or something like this, gives the explanation that myth is always the color of one's imagination. That myth is not black or white or any distinct race or ethnicity. Myth is open. Myth is something that can be interpreted by whoever it is that's reading. And that's actually a point that we also get in Wisu Hamlet, which has a lot of similar kind of gestures to this, a lot of similar sort of postmodern blendings of the European source material with West African myth and West African performance styles. So that's one of the things, is we have these interactions between Tegonni, who is supposed to represent the sort of real character undergoing this storyline, and Antigone, the mythical character who inspired this storyline. So that's one component. The other component is that the politics of Antigone, which are complicated, and I've done a video on Antigone before, and I talked some about the complicated politics of that play. But the politics here are re-envisioned for specifically post-colonial concerns, particularly post-colonial Nigerian concerns, because Osofisan, one of the things that we see widely across the body of his work is an interest in cultural hybridity, in drawing from multiple traditions, multiple sources, to create something new and unique. So, in this play, Tegonni is marrying Captain Alan Jones, who is a white district officer, British colonial administration. He is very much open to African culture, African traditions, actually even joking with an African American missionary about how uncivilized the British are compared to the Yoruba. So he's the sort of Haman figure from Antigone. The Creon figure is a guy named Lieutenant General Carter Ross. And he is exceedingly racist. He's an extremely unpleasant figure who basically has come to this town to officially to restore order from this sort of mini rebellion that's gone on, but also to specifically stop Jones from marrying a black African woman. So, this is Carter Ross's whole thing, is violent authoritarian colonialism. And he makes no bones about this. This isn't like, oh, I'm imposing a reading on him. This is basically what he says, is the only thing that Africans understand is force, and so for the good of the empire, we need to be as forceful as possible. This is essentially his position. So again, not a particularly pleasant fellow. He and Tegonni inevitably clash, and Tegonni consults with Antigone, and Antigone initially says, yeah, you should just give in. I mean, what difference does it make? Like, I fought back against Creon and it didn't do me any good. I still died. You should do the same thing. And Tegonni says, no, I will never give in. I will continue to fight for freedom, because without freedom, what are we? And Antigone says, that's exactly the answer that I'd hoped you would give. So, Tegonni stands up against colonialism, and incidentally also against patriarchy, because although Carter Ross is not necessarily as concerned with gender politics as he is with racial and imperialist politics, Tegonni also represents a kind of women's liberation, because we had learned earlier in the play that she basically invented the Guild of Women's Bronze Casters. So previously, in this Yoruba culture, only men were allowed to be bronze casters, but by learning the trade elsewhere and bringing it back, and then with the help of Alan Jones, the district attorney she's now marrying, Tegonni built a guild of women's bronze casters in defiance of this sort of patriarchal tradition. So, what ultimately ends up happening at the end is actually quite interesting. It's quite a divergence from Sophocles' version, because Tegonni and her bridesmaids are going to be executed by Carter Ross. Alan Jones comes in and it basically attacks Carter Ross and gets shot. But then the other women of this town bare their breasts, covered in ash, and start chanting this curse, and the soldiers flee. So Carter Ross does shoot Tegonni before he dies of a heart attack, but basically the women of this community defeat this imperialist army. Tegonni herself does die, but that's actually not the end that Osofisan envisions. Antigone comes on stage after the sort of rout of this imperialist force and the deaths of basically all of the main characters, and Antigone resurrects Tegonni. She raises her up as a spirit, basically, and the two of them board Yemoja's boat to sail off to the afterlife, the divine, the spirit world, heaven, whatever it is. So basically, even though Tegonni is shot, she doesn't lose in the way that Sophocles' Antigone loses. Like, Sophocles' Antigone hangs herself, and that's the end of it for her. All that's left basically is Creon's suffering. We don't have that in Tegonni. We have, I think, a much more hopeful, a much more positive ending.